we're also likely going to want to get folks who are participating in the focus groups and the committees involved in this documentation process. This is a photo of the process in Livermore, California, where we're doing a code update. We actually took the local planning staff out, sort of gave them a half-day training session in terms of doing this microscale documentation and going through our tables, and sort of they assisted us. They did about 50% of this documentation. And we feel that that's really important to get them engaged in the process. It would be great to have many of you helping us with that process as well. So then the next stage is, after we get all this information gathered, we're actually going to jump into the visioning process. This is where the 4.5 day charrette process comes into play. Sort of the visioning. You need a really strong vision, a community vision, and a plan to actually regulate the form-based code. And so when we come in to do the charrette process, the public workshop, we're not just coming in to sort of put stickies up on the wall. I know a lot of public processes are simply about sort of kind of, feel-good, agreeing on feel-good comments, and sort of what we're actually going to be coming up with really concrete solutions. We're going to be drawing things in plan, we're going to be drawing things three-dimensionally, and we're going to be pinning them up and getting feedback from you all. And so as we're going through the process, there's going to be a lot of design, very specific design that comes out of it. It's going to be directed by you. At the end of that process, we're going to have a vision in place for these form-based code application areas that will then write the code through the force. And so this is a really important part of the process. And then the third step in the process is just putting the document together. So after we've done the documentation, we've done the visioning, the code, sort of putting the code together begins. And so that's the final stage. That's where we come back. Roger will be working with you very specifically in your committees and focus groups on various elements of the code, and we'll come back to engage you all and get your comments on the code as it begins to be drafted. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to do this really quickly because I just wanted as an introduction, but I wanted to throw out the specific elements that are necessary to make a form-based code successful. And this is called the regulating plan. So it's really about regulating places instead of uses. You can see on a first glance, this looks very much like any zoning map that you might see in any community, but when you actually begin to look at the zones, you'll see that the zones are actually based, as I said earlier, on the intended type of place: town core, town center, neighborhood general. So it's about the place, not the use. The building form standards, this is really the nuts and bolts and the meat of the regulations. This is where your setbacks, what we call a build-to line if the buildings want to be addressing the street, happen. The intent here, in addition to creating and reinforcing places in terms of form-based code, is we really want to create a very graphic and usable document. So you'll see here that sort of these are just extracts from a typical form-based code document that we do, where we have really clear graphics and really clear regulations tied to those graphics. So you'll see as I show you these images, it's really a graphic-based code. So it's much easier to understand the intent of each one of those areas. For each zone, like I talked about that, so let's go to the far right transect zone, the downtown zone, T6. You would have 4 pages of regulations specific to that zone. So you'd have this right here that deals with building placement, use and height, parking in terms of the parking requirements and appropriate location of parking, and then sort of encroachments and frontage types. And we'll talk a little bit about frontage types in a little bit. And then this is the second spread. We take a lot of pride in sort of making our use tables very concise and straightforward as well in terms of the usability. We don't want the use tables to override the intent of the overall zone. We need them to support the intent of that zone. So we actually were very fortunate. Paul Crawford was a co-author of the form-based codes book, and he was the real mastermind behind this. And he helped us establish a system of use based on use types. So instead of trying to list every single type of retail that might be appropriate in downtown, for example, you might just call it general retail and leave it really much more open, and simply think about things that might impact adjacent uses like hours of operation, and sort of think about the uses differently more in that way as opposed opposed to listing 150 potential uses for your downtown. So then prescriptive and easy to use. So that's the real intent of the overall code, and in particular the building form standards. Since the form-based codes concentrate on creating a high-quality place, we can't forget about public spaces, the public space standards. And there's two components of this. It's the thoroughfares or street standards, as well as just standards for parks, plazas, squares, paseos. And so we need to look at all of that to make sure all the elements of creating a good place are regulated within the code, as well as adjusted along this transect. Because what's appropriate for a park space or a type of street in a more rural context is not likely the same type of street or park space that's appropriate in a more like downtown context. And so we adjust all those accordingly. So civic spaces, looking at small paseos in a downtown environment, your fantastic sort of public plaza that you have here, which is mostly hardscape, which is very appropriate for a downtown environment. Much different from a grassy, mostly landscaped green space that's more appropriate in a residential neighborhood, for example. So, and I like to show this slide a little bit for me to sort of take a breath and sort of have a little bit of comic relief, but I like to use this to sort of throw up another way to think about the transect. So this is a picture of my, she's now a 6-year-old daughter, but when we were in New York, and I think she was having just as much fun, probably even more fun, playing on this stoop as she could have playing in the playground. So just need to think about these different contexts differently, because obviously there's still playgrounds in this context, but kids can have a great time in an urban context in a different way, and kids can have a great time in this environment. They're both important, but they both play different roles in different areas of that transect that I talked about. Thoroughfare standards. I'm going to talk really briefly about this because Rick Hall, another team member from Hall Planning and Engineering, is here, and he's going to talk more thoroughly about it. But I just like to say that really wide streets are a non-starting point for creating walkable communities. It's one of my initial perceptions as I go around Flagstaff is the thoroughfares really serve as really hard edges and barriers. And I've heard a lot in our interviews about safety, both in terms of pedestrians walking, but especially in terms of biking from one end of town to the other. So it's something we're going to think about, and that's why we're thrilled to have Rick on the team. So you can compare that previous street to this type of street. We're not going to be talking about this type of intensity, obviously, in Flagstaff, but you can begin to see, a great boulevard like this accommodates just as much, if not more, traffic as that street that I just showed. I was actually had the fortune of just being in Paris and sort of experienced a lot of these boulevard streets firsthand. And so just thinking creatively about making sure that streets are really multimodal, they're safe and comfortable for pedestrians, they're achieving certain traffic requirements, and just sort of wanted to show a comfortable street in downtown. This is going to be my last slide in terms of the thoroughfares, and then I'm going to go for Rick, but I like to show this slide to begin to illustrate why street design is really important in terms of pedestrian safety if you really want to get towards creating walkable communities. This is a chart from the National Highway Traffic Association. It deals with pedestrian and auto accidents, both people on foot and on bicycles. At 20 miles per hour, only 5%